Bona nit, soc la María Berríos i directora de conservació en recerca del MACBA. Benvinguts i benvingudes a Canció per a molts moviments. Experimento a mig camí entre una exposició i un programa públic que he tingut el privilegi de comissariar amb el Sabel Gavaldon, cap de programes públics del MACBA. El títol del projecte ve d'un poema de l'autodefinida com a negra, mare, guerrera i poeta, Audre Lorde. Un poema que ens parla que el nostre treball és més rellevant que el nostre silenci. I no se m'ocorre una persona que encara millor aquest espíritu que el nostre convidat d'aquesta nit, Vijay Prashad. I perquè ell pugui entendre millor, em passaré a l'anglès. I de pas aprofito de disculpar-me per el meu català, el que estic en procés d'aprendre. Gràcies per la seva comprensió. So, Vijay, you can come into the...
I'm just fascinated by the gentleman outside and his little red dot.
Oh, great. Oh, he does have a little red dot.
Yeah, sorry. I'm like a cat.
Well, that's part of the spirit of being here, almost on the street, which I think is a very appropriate middle ground to have you. Vijay is a person that I do not feel needs any kind of introduction. A historian, a journalist, maybe I could say a dropout from academia. Also, and very importantly, an executive director of la Tricontinental. And I could also say the most joyous and contagiously joyous Marxist that I know. I actually got to know Vijay through Elvira Dianganiose, who many years ago, when I was doing my PhD, my doctorate, I'm also a dropout from academia, in London, asked me if I knew this book called History of the Darker Nations. And I said, no, this comes from the States. I'm through with all these Marxist dudes. I've read enough for a whole lifetime studying sociology. It's done. I'm not doing that. And she was like, Maria, I think you should read this one. And I did, and I'm very, very glad that I did. And since then, we've been bumping into each other, and now I've learned that you are living basically on my block in Santiago de Chile. But one of the things that I feel is most important about the Tricontinental, about your work, has been this consideration of art, literature, poetry, song, dance, and joy as a revolutionary tool of struggle, as a language, as a way of bridging the divisions and a way to work together in struggle. And I think this is something that not all revolutionaries share. And I think that you incarnate this spirit and also the Tricontinental does, not only the historical one, but very much the contemporary one, incarnates this spirit of, as very famously has been said, if I can't dance, I will not be a part of your revolution, or I can't be a part of your revolution. So I leave you with, and I ask you all for a warm round of applause for this beautiful dancing Marxist.
Okay. Thanks a lot, really. I mean, firstly, I'm really sorry that I'm not inflicting my Spanish on you. That would have been amazing for you, but not today, and certainly not Catalan, the higher form of the language. Not from me today, but maybe next time. Really, thank you for inviting me here. It's a beautiful museum, made more beautiful by the skate park, which is part of this museum. Extraordinary to have people make of the place whatever the hell they want. You know, they are also part of your museum. You can't enjoy this museum without going through them, sometimes at your peril, as I found yesterday, at your peril, piercing away through the great skaters. And then this amazing show that you have, which brings together, you know, the histories of national liberation, the sensibilities of national liberation. You have NATO of MPLA, Angola, talking about why these armed struggle fighters decide to go to Algiers to a meeting to discuss art and culture. And then in the middle of a deadly struggle for survival of their people against Portuguese colonialism. Deadly struggle. It's not a joke, armed struggle, you know. Death and life like this. And yet there they are in Algiers discussing art and culture. It's an incredible show because it brings that together, what NATO is saying, you know. We are committed to building for our people a new culture. And even if you crush us with a coup d'etat, we will create a culture of solidarity. And hence you have the great solidarity exhibitions out of Chile and so on. It's a terrific show, and I really hope people spend time watching the videos, sitting down in those, you know, little spaces and reading some of the books. Some really fabulous pieces of scholarship and literature and so on. Have fun there. It really is fun. I mean, this is a really peculiar time to be sitting in a museum discussing anything. It's a peculiar time. And it's really strange for me to be in Europe, on the European continent, which appears to have, and that's why I say particularly in a museum, it's strange, because Europe strikes me now as being a continent in deep decay, intellectual and political and moral decay. I mean, there is, as the International Court of Justice said, plausible evidence of a genocide being conducted in Gaza against the Palestinian people. Now, today, bombings, the edge of Rafah. The Israelis first said, we're just bombing Gaza City. Go south of Wadi Gaza. People went. Then they went south of Wadi Gaza and bombed them in Khan Yunis. Then they departed from Khan Yunis and chased them all the way down to Rafah. That's happening now, not 10 years ago, yesterday, last year, now, today. And look at the character, first of the European political leadership. None. They don't have a character. I mean, who are these people? Who is the Prime Minister of Spain? I don't even know his name. I barely remember the name of the Chancellor of Germany. What is this guy? Who is the President of France? France, you know, the République. Really? Who are you? Who are you, Emmanuel Macron? You look like a teenager, lost, confused. Rishi Sunak, serious man? Not really. The British Parliament, the so-called mother of all parliaments, they couldn't even discuss the Scottish National Party's ceasefire resolution. They couldn't even discuss it. It ended up in chaos. And I'm not even going to talk about the United States, because that country has lost its way beyond redemption, it looks like. Biden and Trump. You know, these people can't even say the word ceasefire. They say sustainable ceasefire. What is sustainable ceasefire? What the hell is that? They say humanitarian pause. What? What is a humanitarian pause? Don't use the word humanitarian when you merely mean a stop between two bombings. That's a corruption of the word humanitarian. What's happening to the culture when Lord David Cameron can write that we must have a humanitarian pause? Something is decaying in European culture. If the political leaders cannot even have clarities, you want to defend Israel's war, defend it. Defend it openly. Come out and say it. Have a clarity. You are against that bombing? Say it clearly. But this prevarication, while you arm Israel and veto resolutions for a ceasefire, this is not a moral clarity. See, I prefer a clarity. You are in favor of the bombing, tell me you're in favor of the bombing. That's a clarity. This is not a clarity. These people have no moral compass. And I think that's important to register. But it's not just that. I mean, look at the continent. If I was to ask you, and I was in Paris recently and asked a range of people at the CGT office where I gave a presentation. I asked them in Paris, who is the Jean-Paul Sartre of our time in France? Are there any leading intellectuals with a moral voice who stand up there and say, this is wrong, and we are going to now put together a statement saying this is wrong? Who is the leading Spanish intellectual, the great philosophers now, as they had been at a previous time? I mean, where is the great Hegel of Germany today? They don't have any intellectuals like that. There are no intellectuals in France that are willing to clearly say, publicly, of the stature of Jean-Paul Sartre, willing to say, this is an abomination. You have now a cartoon character version of the great intellectuals of Europe. You remember Bernard Henry Levy, who goes to Libya with his shirt open to here, with his hair airbrushed, shirt open to here saying, bomb them, telling Sarkozy at that time. That's the level of European intellectualism. It has collapsed. You don't have an intellectual class anymore. What you have is people too afraid to lose their jobs. Too afraid to lose their jobs. People don't speak because they're afraid to lose the money they make in order to remain silent. That's the reality of the situation. That's a culture in decay, my friends. When people are not willing to say what a court has said, which is, by the way, not based in Asia, not based in Africa, it's based in Europe. The International Court of Justice, based in Europe. The court has said, it's not crazy people like me saying there's a genocide happening in Gaza. Of course, I'm also saying that as a crazy person. Every kingdom has its court, and every court has its jester, and every jester makes jokes for the king. And sometimes the small number of leftists that exist in the world are like jesters. But the fool is the one who says the truth. And everybody else in the court just praises the king. It's the fool who says to the king, you don't have any clothes on. Everybody else says, wow, you're dressed in the best outfit. So sometimes the fool has the science. And today, I don't even see that many fools. It's a European court that says there's plausible evidence of genocide, and yet there is almost near silence. Not from young people who are agitating on the street in Britain, in France, and so on, which is why these morally bankrupt so-called leaders have criminalized the attempt to speak out on behalf of people who are victims of a genocide. They can't have the conversation. They don't want to have a discussion, a dialogue. Okay? I would like to say to people, it's an invitation to a dialogue. Come and talk to me. I want to talk to you. Let's talk about what's happening, let's say, in Rafah. What's happening when children are dying of starvation. Let's talk about that. What does that mean? There are 2 million people in Goma, in the Democratic Republic of Congo. There are military forces amassed outside Goma. 10 million children have died in the eastern part of Congo over the last 30 years because of that war. Let's have a conversation about it. I don't want to prejudge, the outcome. Let's have they don't want to have the conversation. They are banning the conversation. And friends, the worst of all is Germany. Germany. I'm going to come back to Germany at the end. But I'm not going to give up on talking to you about Germany. But I'm going to come back to it. Because Germany has gone the furthest in criminalizing the conversation about what's happening in Gaza now. Criminalized. I don't mean this in a propagandistic way. Like, oh, they are criminalizing. No, they are actually criminalizing dissent on this issue. Not on all issues, which is clever, which is why this is a class question. It's not a general question of freedoms. You have a lot of freedom. You can go to the wall and you can spray paint "fuck you" and you'll win the Turner Prize. But if you write something about Palestine, you could go to jail. So you don't have no freedom. You have lots of freedom. So it's a political question. On some issues, verboten. You cannot go there. You are not permitted to have that conversation. But that's where we are. That's where we have to begin. And in the institute that I direct, which I really want to talk to you about, but it's really hard for me to talk about anything than what's happening. It's really, I have to push myself now, control myself. Let's talk about the institute. That's what I promised. I was going to come here and talk about the institute because we are in a direct line of relationship to all that stuff that's in the room next door. We are in a direct relationship. We come out of that history. We are in conversation with that history. We love that history. It's a powerful history. So I really do want to stop now from this and come to that. But I'm going to return to this. Don't worry. This is not going anywhere. Okay? 10 years ago, I was in a conversation in just outside São Paulo, Brazil, with the Landless Workers Movement of Brazil, the MST, or MST, and other political groups. And we were discussing how international solidarity in this period has really fallen apart. It's complicated. We sort of, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, tried out the World Social Forum, which continues. There was just a meeting in Nepal, in Kathmandu, an important process, but it's a process that's not rooted in the movements. It's become a place where people travel, NGOs and so on, to have important and necessary discussions. But we thought movements need to be at the center of things. And in that sense, which we wanted to produce, this movements at the center of things, we started talking about building a new platform. We called it, it's a clumsy name, the International People's Assembly. To build the International People's Assembly, which is very much in the tradition of the whole national liberation movements of the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, to build that, we wanted to create certain work environments, let's call them. One, build a network of journalists and people in the media so that they can also learn to write about what movements are doing. One of the tragedies of the collapse of the Soviet Union, that period, and the urgency or the madness of neoliberalism, one of the tragedies is that the medias have consolidated. And really nobody writes about what ordinary people are doing, their struggles and so on. If they do, it's often just a photograph, or it's really to belittle them. Like, for instance, the Indian farmers went on effectively an enormous strike. They built the Delhi Commune 2 years ago, and they defeated the government on some farm bills. Reporting on that was minimal. Millions of people. Almost every year in India, there's a general strike, 250 million workers. It's not covered in the press. I doubt El País even has a little tiny section on it. I very much doubt it. So the media coverage of our movements has deteriorated. So the first area of work was to build networks of journalists, of media providers and so on, to try to educate each other, give each other confidence to cover the stories of ordinary people's struggles and so on. The second was to build political schools. The MST comes out of the tradition of Paulo Freire, one of the great educators, educating intellectuals of an earlier period. If you haven't read Paulo Freire's book, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, I highly recommend it to you. It's called Pedagogy of the Oppressed. It's an incredible book about how ordinary people who don't come from the classes which have generations of culture, how ordinary people learn, and how one has to create an environment for ordinary people, peasants, workers, people who have not had cycles of cultural privilege, how to create environments for them to work. MSIT built on the thinking of people like Paulo Freire, Florestan Fernandes, a great Brazilian Marxist, other people like that. They built a school called, in fact, I said Florestan Fernandes. The school is called Escola Nacional de Florestan Fernandes, just outside São Paulo, where they train people, political people, in how to understand the world. So you have peasant activists, worker unionists, and so on, people working in the anti-dam movement. They come to this school, they sit around much like this, and educators who are trained to create the environment for learning teach. And then we teach together, we learn together. In fact, one of the great things about leaving the formal bourgeois academy was that I now teach in these schools, in political schools. I was in a school recently teaching young people in the Arab world about how to write and how to think about writing. It was a writing workshop. It's a writing workshop that I would perhaps give to young people from a bourgeois background as well. Things like, what do you have to say within you? It's not that some people can write and some people can't write. It's that you're not allowing the stories to be channeled. What do you want to say? You know, when people say I have a writer's block, I always tell them, you don't have a writer's block, you have a thinking block. You haven't thought about what you want to say. You know, and it's not a question of writing, it's a form of expression. There are so many ways to express yourself. Go and dance. You know, record a song, play your guitar. There's a million things you can do. But you can't do any of those things if you don't know what you want to say. That's prior. You know, any form of expression relies on some, you know, understanding of what story do I want to tell. So the schools are a place out of the International People's Assembly to help organizers from peasant backgrounds, working class backgrounds, and so on, displaced people, oppressed communities, help them, help us to help each other together to learn. So that's the second thing. And the third thing they said was we would like to have a research institute. We think it's important for our people, peasant organizers, peasant organizations, farmers organizations, working class movements, and so on, movements of excluded and oppressed people in cities. We need to have a place where we can come in and start building research projects. So it's out of that conversation that this institute was born, Tricontinental Institute for Social Research. We do a lot of our research alongside movements. We have the movements give us people to build a certain project, and we train the peasant leaders and so on, how to do sociological research, how to do survey research, how to do anthropological research, and then they go out and do it. You know, we work with them, we accompany them. I joke with our team that we're the McKinsey of the working class. We're a consultancy. You know, we consult with the workers and peasants, showing them where you can, you know, we can come in and we can help you, but you're going to have to do this yourself. We can provide some of the means and so on. Well, the name is interesting. And let me spend a minute on the name. Because the name of the institute that I direct, Tricontinental Institute for Social Research, refers to two histories. And both are important and interesting to me. The second, Institute for Social Research, is in fact an interesting history because it's rooted in Frankfurt. It's the Frankfurt School. Now, the origin of the Frankfurt School, Institute for Social Research, the origin is interesting. These were initially Marxist intellectuals who were confused by the fact that the working class in the 1930s, also but in the late 20s, was drifting away from socialism towards the right. They were going towards fascism. This is something that Antonio Gramsci, sitting in an Italian prison, also wondered about. Why is it that the Italian working class abandoned socialist parties and movements and drifted into the arms of fascism? Well, 10 years ago, when we were coming up with the name for this institute, I thought, let's revive that name, because we are living in the same moment now, when sections of working class people, peasants, oppressed people are drifting into the arms of the right. And we need to understand why that is. You can't just condemn a people. What did Hillary Clinton call the supporters of Donald Trump? She just condemned them. She said these people are something or the other, something offensive, for people. Rather than offend people, say that they are, whatever, disposable people, or they are, nutcases, or whatever you call people. In fact, one has to understand why people are going in that direction. So when we started doing our work, we found that in the favelas in Brazil, as an example, I was curious, why are so many young people going into these right-wing evangelical churches? These are young people. What are they doing in the churches? So when our researchers, who were from the favela, went and started to ask people, they're from a youth movement, they found something quite interesting. For instance, there used to be a time, I remember this from my youth, when you had government support for schools. Remember when governments actually funded schools in the very old days, when there was some commitment to the human beings that lived inside societies? Governments decided we won't spend all that money on guns, on tanks, on missiles. We're going to actually have teachers well paid in schools so that they can be attentive to young people. And hey, listen, we're going to have sports, because sports are important. They're a way to channel people's physical activity and build up their skills. Also, we're going to have music, because music's important. It's important for young people to learn scales. It's important for them to have something that they can enjoy, in their life, something that enriches their sense of self. Okay, so let's have music. Well, as you know, over this hideous period of neoliberalism, education institutions have been cut. Schools have lost a lot of funding. They're just unable to pay teachers an adequate salary, and the things they've cut are art classes and music. So, in the favelas, lots of kids go to the evangelical church to learn to play the guitar. That's why they're going there. They're not necessarily some horrible kids who are driven by some, homophobic pastor preaching some nonsense. They go there to play the guitar. They go there to play the piano, because these churches have the money to teach people, young people, how to do these things. If you live in a favela, or if you live in a slum in Bombay, there is no way you're going to access these kinds of skills unless you go through some of these institutions. When you privatize this kind of skill delivery, that's what you get. So we discovered this because of the young researchers who live in that favela, understand what to look for. They don't come with a prejudged attitude. So we built some pretty good knowledge about why people are going to the right. That's why Institute for Social Research. We're trying to understand why are so many people attracted to some of these ideas. And then we discovered maybe not always the ideas. Maybe they're just attracted to the resources there. And that's what they go for. The first part of the name of the institute, Tricontinental, of course refers to an incredible conference held in Havana, Cuba in 1966. Just a word about that, because it's interesting and it's not always known what these things meant in those days. After World War II, a number of national liberation movements emerged across the globe, in Africa, Asia, Latin America, fighting against the hideousness of colonialism, the wretchedness of colonialism. There were some early victories. India, Pakistan won their independence in 1947. After a really difficult struggle in 1948, the Indonesians won their independence. And then slowly other countries moved into the ranks of the independent. But in 1955, the Indonesians, only 7 years into their independence, held a conference in a beautiful town of Bandung. The town is beautiful because the Dutch built this town in the Art Deco style. So even now when you go to Bandung, there are these beautiful Art Deco bungalows. It's a gorgeous little town. In this little town, President Sukarno of Indonesia invited 28 countries from Africa and Asia. The 29th was Indonesia. And they held a conference where they declared that they were going to help countries in the global south, at that time the third world, win their independence. Because colonialism was an abomination and had to be defeated. It's very interesting when you read the Bandung communique, because there's a very long section on culture. Again, I'm going to come back to that in a minute. After Bandung, 1961, Nasser of Egypt, Sukarno of Indonesia, Nehru of India, Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana, which had just won its full independence in 1959, and Joseph Broz Tito of Yugoslavia, the great partisan leader, had a meeting in Belgrade in 1961, which created the non-aligned movement. A very important development, bringing together the vast majority of the people of the world, a movement to contest the power of the old colonial bloc that had dominated this young institution called the United Nations. They want to contest them. In 1966, Fidel Castro held the Tricontinental meeting, bringing together national liberation fighters from Africa, Asia, Latin America, saying that the non-aligned movement was for governments, those who had already won their independence, but we need to have a different space for national liberation movements, such as the PAIGC from Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde, led by Amilcar Cabral, such as the Vietnamese, such as the Algerians, and so on. They need to come, not the Algerians then, but the Vietnamese. They need to come to a place like Havana, which had again just won its revolution in 1959, and they need to have a free and frank discussion of how to overthrow colonialism. This is in 1966. But I also want to footnote something here for you, because this is also interesting. United Nations had passed a resolution, a UN resolution in the General Assembly, which has an extraordinary sentence, one of the most beautiful pieces of writing in the 20th century. This UN resolution, and by the way, UN resolutions, not known for good writing, yeah? Mostly quite dull and bureaucratic, but this resolution on decolonization is incredible, because the sentence is, the process of, this is a direct quote, the process of liberation is irresistible and irreversible. The process of liberation is irresistible and irreversible. That is a beautiful sentence. Irresistible. It cannot be resisted. That means liberation was inevitable. But also it's irreversible. Once we win our independence, we're not going back. I think that sentence is profound. And the Tricontinental, the process set in place in Havana, Cuba, is rooted in that slogan. The process of liberation is irresistible and irreversible. That was the Tricontinental meeting. Out of the meeting came an organization called the Organization in Solidarity with the Peoples of Africa, Asia, and Latin America, OSPAL. And OSPAL created a magazine called Tricontinental. Our institute is directly out of that lineage, out of the lineage of that magazine, in fact, which was a magazine about national liberation struggles around the world. Here's the interesting thing, and I'm really happy to be in a museum which has that exhibit talking about this. Here's the interesting thing. After every revolution, there is an urgency to create new art and new language. This was very clear after the revolution in 1917. Krupskaya, who was a major educator in the young Soviet Republic, writes about how after the revolution of 1917, she goes into a meeting of working class and peasant women, and she says these women can't stop talking. They're talking over each other because they've been silent for centuries. They have so much to say to each other. And they don't want to speak the language of the past. You know that language, right? The language of civility. I mean, look at most Romance languages. There are so many levels of honorifics. You don't just have you have all these ways of saying you, the honored one, you, the middle honored one, you, the lower honored. What the hell is this? Why don't you just have a you? It's not democratic to have this feudal stuff in your language. Super feudal language. So these women were, let's reject it. Vladimir Mayakovsky, the great Soviet poet, wrote poetry sometimes in gibberish, looking for the new language. It was not enough to just continue to talk in that old aristocratic Russian. A new Russian was necessary. Gibberish sometimes, because you might have to go through gibberish to create something real, democratic, and so on. And the art, the beautiful art, the way in which constructivism emerges in that early period. Lissitzky. What is Lissitzky doing? What are those lines? Because it's not just now art, it's also engineering. When Lenin said that socialism is the Soviets plus electrification, engineering. If you look at the constructivists, they are engineers. They are working with lines and angles and all kinds of fascinating things, looking for a new language. After the Cuban Revolution, similarly, absolute explosion of language, art, the amazing films made after the Cuban Revolution. I mean, there's a film there from Argentina, which is basically out of that lineage, of Santiago Alvarez and those filmmakers, those extraordinary people who took montage and shock, montage, big fonts attacking you, coming at you, words like liberation. Our word now is liberation, 5 of them attacking you. Interestingly, many of these artists who also worked in the Tricontinental magazine used to be advertising artists. They worked for McCann, these American advertising companies in Cuba. They come out of the they knew Madison Avenue. They came from advertising, but they took those skills and created a new language. Somebody once said, oh yeah, that Cuban art, it's like pop art. No, it's not. Pop art is like the Cuban art. Because in fact, some of this stuff predates it. The use of color, the incredible, layered, mystical way that they created, put pink next to green, and things that are crazy. They did crazy things. In the Tricontinental magazine, every issue had a poster. It was a fold-out poster. And on these posters, they played with surrealistic forms of thinking. After Che Guevara was assassinated in 1967, there was posters of Che's face in these magazines. Psychedelic things, 6 Che faces emerging out of, a tunnel or something. Very playful, bright, brilliant young artists because they were searching for the new language. You can't have the old colonial Spanish or the Yankee traditions of the gangsters and the mobsters and Madison Avenue. You can't have that. You have to create something new languages. If you even listen to early speeches by Fidel, he's trying to cultivate a new discourse on the island, talking plainly, clarities, moral clarity. It's a new language. It's not something inherited. We come out of that tradition because we also believe in the 2 essential parts of what they were doing in that revolution, the Cuban Revolution, but in all revolutions really, not just in the Cuban Revolution, the Chinese Revolution. New language, ending foot binding, saying that women mustn't walk behind a man. Things like that, which you might think, well, that's trivial. It's not trivial. You travel to Asia today. I was born in Calcutta. We are old civilizations, older than yours in many ways. We have inherited old ways of doing things. It took a real sense of the newness of the Chinese Revolution to erase some of these things. Gender-based violence in India is at a high. It continues to be a problem that plagues society because we haven't built the new. You don't have that in China. You don't have those levels of gender-based violence and so on. In fact, those cities are pretty safe in comparison to India. There was just a terrible, terrible assault on some tourists recently in India, which got some news. It requires a kind of urgency to transform the wretchedness of culture. You got to have some sort of urgency. Also, there's a naivete in this, okay? Young revolutionaries emerge and they think we're going to change society. Sorry, pal, it takes a really long time to uproot the taproot of culture. It goes deep into society, into the way people interact and so on. Things can come back Engels said history doesn't move in a straight line, moves in zigs and zags. Things return to the past. You can't have that naive sense. Although without that naive hope, there's nothing. Without that naive hope, we live in a world today with so much layers of cynicism, layers and layers of eye rolling. Somebody says something sincere, I would really like to change the world. People roll their eyes, oh God, not another one of these nuts. We live under mountains of cynicism that it is in fact quite refreshing to just get a sense of the naivete that emerges in an early revolutionary period. When I see the young kids marching now, yelling things like ceasefire now, there is a naivete there. I mean, look, the people in power are hideous. Those kids, high school kids in Italy, who were trapped in a tunnel between buildings and beaten savagely by the Italian carabinieri. Brutal beating of those kids. Those kids were yelling, ceasefire now. I prefer their naivete than the cynicism of the baton. Nobody wants the cynicism of the baton, but go tell that to the professors in the university. That's where they live. Two aspects I want to draw out from the tradition of the Cuban Revolution and all revolutions. These are two concepts that are important for us. One is the battle of ideas, and the other is the battle of emotions. The battle of ideas, pretty straightforward notion really. I'll give you an example. One of the ways in which we produce or try to develop the battle of ideas, in fact, argue for the need for the conversation, was the beginning of my presentation here. That actually was a demonstration of what the battle of ideas looks like. We, in our institute, use a phrase, the international division of humanity. There is an international division of humanity. You remember at the start of the Russian tanks entering Ukraine, the Russians beginning that war, and then people saying we got to help the Ukrainians, and then a Ukrainian official saying they have blonde hair, they have blue eyes, and then Europe saying all Ukrainians are welcome, you can come. But where was the welcome to the Syrians? Where was the welcome to the Afghans, the Iraqis? I mean, for God's sake, you created that illegal war against the Iraqis. Where was the welcome for them? There's an international division of humanity. We need to acknowledge that. There's an international division of humanity for the Yemenis. The government of Yemen, led by Ansar Allah, says that we're going to prevent ships carrying arms to conduct, that are going to go and continue that plausible genocide. We are going to stop those ships. Okay, why doesn't a Western leader, Prime Minister of Spain maybe, or somebody else, fly to Sana'a and sit down and talk to the Yemeni government and say, this is not a good idea. No, you don't need to talk to the Yemenis. You just fire a cruise missile into Yemen. That's the international division of humanity. Diplomacy by bombing. You might remember Sudan, the Clinton administration, not even a conversation with the government of Umar al-Bashir. Instead, they fired in 1996 into Khartoum, bombing the Al-Shifa medical facility, the only pharmaceutical factory in that part of Africa. And by the way, the only pharmaceutical factory in Africa that produced drugs for malaria. Now there is none. The Yanks just bombed that without talking to the government of Umar al-Bashir. If it were any other conflict, they would have diplomacy. Diplomacy for certain people. That's the international division of humanity. This, my friends, is another demonstration of the battle of ideas. Don't accept their premises. Come right to the heart of it. Why should I accept the premise of the conversation? If I was to have a discussion with Rishi Sunak, why should I let him set the terms for the conversation? What am I afraid of? Let's go to the heart of the matter, Rishi. Let's go right to the root of it. Let's be radicals, which means go to the root of the matter. Let's not play around with semantics and verbiage and so on and talk about sustainable ceasefires. Let's get right down to it. Sustainable development, not for me. That's a really crazy term, and we can go into that another day. Not for me, sustainable development or sustainable ceasefire. For me, ending poverty, ending hunger, ending homelessness. Those are real, not sustainable development. Real things. Dignity for people, that's real. That's the battle of ideas. The second concept is interesting. It's the battle of emotions. People are not just moved by ideas or an ideological debate and dispute. People want something deeper than that. They feel things. In our institute, we have all kinds of art in our publications. We come out of the lineage of the Tricontinental magazine. We try our best to do our own kinds of interesting art forms. All our material available on our website. It's free download. And all our material is, I think, quite beautiful. This is, for instance, a dossier on the militarization of Africa. Photographs of bases which were put up on a big wall, and then we used twine and like wool to connect them, to show the interconnected nature of Western military bases on the African continent. Emotions, coming to the heart of things. Frantz Fanon, in Wretched of the Earth, writes about violence. That's an interesting and much misunderstood chapter, the first chapter of Wretched of the Earth, called Concerning Violence. What Fanon is saying isn't that, hey, listen, everybody go out and do armed struggle. That's a complete misunderstanding of Fanon. What he's saying is very interesting. What he's saying is that you, colonizer, you imposed violence on us. You caged us. You treat us like animals. And when you treat us like animals, we will react with violence. Your violence is going to become our violence. So if you have kids that are always being under surveillance by the police, and the police throw them against the wall, and they harass them, and they take away their skateboards and do this and that to them, the kids are going to react violently. That reaction of violence that the colonized has is a spontaneous reaction. That is the spontaneity of their reaction. They react spontaneously because your structure is violent. They react back spontaneously, violently. Anybody who's occupied is going to react violently to a violent occupation. That is the nature of a spontaneous consciousness. That's what Fanon is arguing. But then Fanon argues there, and in his earlier work, argues that the point of our struggle, of the national liberation struggle, the point of our struggle is not to leave us in the state of needing to be violent and angry. The point of the national liberation struggle is for us to find our humanity, to be human, to find our dignity. And that's why we organize into large mass movements. That's why we build struggles in which we have a sense of confidence regained, we learn certain clarities about politics, and we become human. Aadmi tha, badi mushkil se insaan hua. We were people, with great difficulty we became human. That's what Fanon is really talking about. It's a battle of emotions. It's a battle of emotions for people to learn and believe that they have the capacity to change the world, not be fed a culture of cynicism that teaches them nothing can be done. The only thing you can do is you can respond with spontaneous consciousness, fight violently against a structure of violence. It's the battle of emotions that suggests that, in fact, there's a big journey for people who have been treated as animals to become human, to fight as human beings, to learn that they have not only the capacity to fight, but they have the necessity to win. That's the battle of emotions. It's an emotional sensibility that has to be crafted. Those are the two concepts, the battle of ideas and the battle of emotions, important sensibilities. I promised I was going to come back to Germany, and here's where I'm coming to a close with this. I promised I was going to talk about Germany, because it's impossible not to. It was South Africa, not a European country, that took the case to the International Court of Justice against Israel. It was brave Naledi Pandor, the foreign minister of South Africa, who put this on the table. Brave Naledi Pandor, one of the great foreign ministers of our time. She was extremely courageous to move this agenda. South Africa brought the case, not Spain, not France, not the United Kingdom, not Germany, nobody. And then, the case sitting there in the court, Germany puts its hand up. And Germany said, this is not a genocide happening in Israel. I surrender. Just let me repeat that. Germany said, because they know a genocide, Germany said, this is not a genocide happening in Israel. And, you know, people said the normal things about the Holocaust and so on in criticism, right? But then a voice comes from Namibia. Now, this is interesting. This is what we consider the new mood that's growing in the South. South Africa takes the case. And then Namibia responds to Germany. What did the president of Namibia say? He released a statement. It's a really interesting statement. It's a reminder to the German people about history. What the president of Namibia said was that, wait a minute, you don't really have a moral compass here when it comes to adjudicating what is or isn't a genocide. Because you conducted a genocide in 1904 until 1908. You conducted a genocide 1904 to 1908. You may have forgotten that genocide, we haven't. That was the elimination of the Namikwa and Herero people of Southwest Africa, now Namibia. You annihilated these communities in those 4 years. You have never apologized for it. But we have not forgotten. We have not forgotten, and we never will. 1904 to 1908. How many of you knew about the elimination of the Herero and Namikwa people in those 4 years? The genocide conducted by the Germans in Southwest Africa is so little known. And I'll tell you something. I bet you German students aren't taught this at all. I bet you it doesn't appear in the curriculum in Germany. Because that country has blinded itself of its own history. You know, in the urgency of not really coming to terms with the Holocaust, the emergence of Nazism, in order not to come to terms with that history. And longer, the long European history of anti-Semitism, deep roots of anti-Semitism. In Spain, I mean, for God's sake, the Reconquista, what was that all about? Expulsion of Muslims, the conversion. What a peculiar word to use. The conversion of the Moriscos and, you know, the Jews, and then hanging huge chunks of ham at the entryway of every bar. So if you're coming in and you don't eat pork, you have to sort of slide through the door. What is that history? Forgotten. Where is Moses Maimonides? You know, the great Ibn Rushd and Ibn Sina and the great academies in Andalusia. Where is all that? This is a tourist thing now. Now you have millions of tourists coming to see the Alhambra. What history is that? That's a Disneyland version of Spain's own history. The deep seat of anti-Semitism in the whatever that was called, the great, you know, period after the Reconquista. What about that history? Poland, Russia, Germany, long history of asking, are Jews capable of becoming German citizens? By the way, they had an academic category for that called the Judenfrage, the Jewish question. That was not a debate in Palestine in the 19th century. Palestinian Christians, Palestinian Muslims, Palestinian Jews lived together. That was not a debate in my hometown of Calcutta. In my hometown of Calcutta, there's a market called New Market. It's not new, it's been there for a long time, but that's its name. In the middle of New Market in Calcutta, there is a little bakery called Nahum's, which was built by a family of Baghdadi Jews, because there was a long trade relationship between Calcutta and Beirut through Baghdad. In fact, Vidal Sassoon's family, the Sassoons of Beirut, some of them came to Paris, and you got Vidal Sassoon, and the other Sassoons came to Calcutta, and they built the biggest synagogue in the city. That little bakery called Nahum's is an interesting place. It's owned by a Jewish family, a Baghdadi Jewish family. Everybody in the kitchen who works there are Muslims, almost everybody. They are famous for making a Christmas cake. You know those ridiculous British Christmas cakes, fruit cake that you pour brandy on and light on fire? And almost the entire clientele, a line of people waiting to buy this Christmas cake at Christmas time, almost the entire clientele is Hindu. That's the world we live in. That's the old world. That's what Palestine was like. People just lived together. Maybe there was conflicts. Maybe people did communalize a conflict and say, we don't like them. But they lived together for centuries. There was no Judenfrage in Calcutta or in Palestine. That's a German problem. But Germany and Europe is blind to its own history. It's blinded itself. And now it blames everybody else for its problems. If Germany, for instance, after 1945, wanted to have some sort of transformation, why did it not invite those exiled Jewish families, German Jewish families, back to Germany? Why wasn't there a serious attempt to create a world in Germany which welcomed people back? They didn't. Instead, they immediately recognized Israel. Let's outsource the problem. Let's make it somebody else's problem. Germany. Now Germany, claiming to have this high moral ground on this issue, criminalizing anybody who speaks up for the Palestinians. That's our struggle now, friends. We are in a battle of ideas. We are in a battle of emotions. We are trying to rebuild a connection to that history of national liberation, because that history, that process of liberation is irresistible and irreversible. And we have to slough off all of that fog of cynicism, taste a little bit of the naivete, struggle as hard as we can to become humans again. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Vijay. I would like to open the floor. Las preguntas se pueden hacer en cualquier idioma. Bueno, aquí ya tenemos una. I was sure there was already shaking questions on the floor.
Thank you. Thank you for your talk. Great. So I'm from Beirut.
You're from?
Beirut.
Ah, okay.
We're both, right? And I liked when you said how we live together even though we have lots of prejudices about each other, right? So because, I mean, that is what I love about Beirut, even though we grew up in the Civil War, which was at that time Christian against Muslim, but the complexity, I mean, the complication of the issue is really far beyond that, okay? But I really liked what you know, brought up as, even though we were different, also in Damascus, by the way, also in Aleppo. I know because my grandma is from Damascus too, and so on. In those places, people lived side by side. You would hear the adhan, and then you would hear the church, and then you would hear... They had maybe prejudices, but they had to deal together, and they had to live side by side. And I really miss that. Yeah.
I miss that too. I mean, I don't know if you want me to, yeah, I miss that as well. I mean, I grew up in an India which is also under a real threat of obliterating conviviality, you know, the desire to live beside people. Of course, people had prejudices. I mean, it would be inconceivable to imagine a world where people don't like other people. You know, even the best of us don't like other people. Some people, there's something about them that we don't like. Yeah, prejudices exist. They are something that we have to learn to deal with. You can't imagine, I can't imagine a world unless we're all on drugs. You know, I can't imagine a world where people are just smiling at each other and saying, nice to see you. I mean, I need a lot of Xanax to be polite to everybody, you know. We don't like some people or the tics they have, you know. Look, it's silly things also, the kind of music. I lived as a young student, college person in a neighborhood in Delhi called Nizamuddin. There was a beautiful old dargah, you know, place where a saint is buried, Hazrat Nizamuddin Aulia. And in his dargah, they played Qawwali music 24 hours a day. Yeah. Now, I actually like Qawwali music, and I was okay with that. But I lived on room on a roof, and there were light poles, and on the light poles there were loudspeakers. And they didn't play the Qawwali through the loudspeaker. They played the azan from the mosque. And that was annoying because, I don't know if you guys know, but in Islam, there are times of prayer which are great for believing Muslims, but they're not great for others who want to sleep. So at like 3:30 in the morning, right into my sleeping area. That was not pleasant. So, you can start feeling like I'm going to break and conflicts happen around things like that. But that's different than I want to annihilate a people. That's a different sensibility. And this, I want to annihilate a people. I mean, it's really interesting, this word Nakba. It's an interesting word. It was coined by a Lebanese historian, Constantine Zorayak, wrote a book after 1948 to describe what had happened to the Palestinians from their homes, ejected. And he used the word Nakba. He introduces the word to that event. Catastrophe. That's an interesting word. The word is catastrophe. That's a big word, catastrophe. This has been a catastrophe for the Palestinians, a catastrophe. And I used to live in Beirut, and I went once to interview Elias Khoury, the novelist, who was the editor of the Journal of Palestinian Studies, in his office, smoking away, drinking so much coffee. And Elias Khoury said to me, I wanted to learn the word Nakba. What does it mean really? What are the resonances in Arabic? Who had used it before Zorayak and so on? And he was fascinating. But then he said to me, that Nakba of 1948, in fact, it's a permanent Nakba. It's not an event, it's a process, and it continues till now. And to hear high officials of the Israeli government now say Gaza Nakba, second Nakba, these are high elected officials of the Israeli government. These are all, by the way, words you can read in the 29-page submission by the South Africans to the International Court of Justice. They have a section on effectively hate speech, and there are these quotes, Gaza Nakba, second Nakba, human savages, and so on. Catastrophe. What a word. Because catastrophe is different from, I don't like your music. There's a big gulf. And I don't think we should ever forget the gulf between prejudice and genocide. Because prejudices can be dealt with. They are things humans have. I think it's one of those traits that it's hard to really get rid of. Even the best of us harbors some feeling about somebody. Sometimes we collectivize it, sometimes it's individualized. I don't like that person. I don't like the way they talk. They talk too close, or they talk too much, or whatever, that person. But then you collectivize it. I don't like those people. And then it starts to get dangerous. Prejudices start to get dangerous. But this is not a prejudice. This is a catastrophe. It's annihilationism. What's happening in the eastern part of Congo is a catastrophe. It's a Nakba of a different kind. So many people displaced. Horrible.
As always, I'm not afraid to wait, because I think it's very important that the floor has some space.
Thank you again. My question, which is with regards to maybe the next talk is going to treat this more specifically, which is funding, and you talked about the school that you're directing. My question is, who pays the salaries? And in the case of the professors who are resigning in masses right now in Germany, what is the next step that you imagine?
So it was interesting 15 years ago or so when I started thinking about this. What are the ways to raise money to build the research institute that I work in, or other people, schools and so on. How do you raise the money? Firstly, our movements don't have the money. These are peasant organizations. They barely are able to cover the salaries of full-time organizers, who are not paid very much anyway. So the movements don't have money. The states that are sympathetic to the work we are doing, like the Cuban government, they don't have the money. And I would not want to get money from the Cuban government. They have a hard enough time, managing electricity grids and so on. But sympathetic people like that just don't have the funds anymore. That's why they're sympathetic. They are sympathetic because they are also struggling to make a new kind of world. They are not flush with money. Foundations is an interesting story. Which foundations? Do you think anything I've said is going to appeal to a grant manager at the Open Society? Open Society, that phrase itself comes from Karl Popper, the great anti-communist. Karl Popper, George Soros. Brother, take me for a beer, let's have a conversation, The big plutocrats exist, but most of them are not interested in changing the world, most of them. So their foundations are certainly not going to help. And there are public foundations. Europe is, filled with them. But again, many of them are too scared to fund things which they think are outside the crayon line drawn for them, including Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung. This is outside their lines. This kind of thing is not for them, They fund NGOs and so on. And by the way, they only have 4 years to go, because Die Linke is never going to win above 5% in any election coming after this. There's a new party in Germany split out of Die Linke, led by Sarah Wagenknecht. Die Linke is never going to cross 5%. Anybody here who is relying on Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung money, it's ending in 4 years. I'm just telling you, it's not going to be there. So, foundations, impossible. Now, if I appeal to all of you, hey, we have a website, we have all the ways, PayPal, however you can give. I would barely raise anything. When I make an appeal, I send out a newsletter every week, and I actually would like you all to sign up for it. It comes in, I think, 20 languages: Spanish, Portuguese, English, Hindi, Malayalam, Chinese, French, all kinds of languages. It goes to over 1 million people, this newsletter. So when I write to over 1 million people and say, hey, listen, we are desperate to raise some money, we raise quite a lot of money, but not enough to run an operation, that we are running. Because people just don't have the money to donate, 5 euros, 15 euros per head. Now, if there were 50 million people donating €1, that's a lot of money, yeah? Okay, but that's not what happens. What happens is 1 or 2% of the total number of people who get the newsletter send something, and it's often very small, modest. And often, by the way, the poor donate more than the rich. You might know this. This is in the world of philanthropy. The rich look like they're donating a lot of money, but it's a much smaller percentage of their income. So when I'm at a peasant thing, people will say, they'll put money down and say, this is the money for us to go and eat dinner together after our class today. And that is a lot more, higher percentage of their earnings than what the rich. So I find that the best way to raise money is to look for sympathetic, very rich people. And that's what I do. Rock musicians, artists, those who are super, intergalactically famous and who have a left-wing profile. And they give money because they are actually invested in some of these ideas. So I spend a lot of my time traveling around talking to extremely wealthy people who are interested in supporting, a peasant school in Tanzania. And I don't really have any problem with that, because sometimes these are extremely interesting and idiosyncratic people. So if you know any, Javier Bardem, for instance, I'd like to talk to Javier Bardem, and ask him, maybe he can give me 1% of the earnings from his next film, which is a lot of money, And I mean, I'm very happy to say that for instance, Roger Waters is very generous with everything I do, extremely generous. He's a tremendous person. And the way he was treated by the German government is abysmal. Abysmal. It's shameful, actually. In Buenos Aires, the hotels wouldn't even rent him a room. Did you know that? He played Buenos Aires. He had to go and stay in Uruguay because the hotels of Buenos Aires wouldn't rent him a room. Yeah, that's the world we live in, guys. That's the culture of the 21st century. Yeah? Yeah, he opens this show he did. This is not a drill. He opens the show by saying, I have two things to say to you before I start. First, silence your cell phones, etc., etc. Secondly, if you've come to hear Roger play Pink Floyd songs and not talk about things he believes in, fuck off. That's the second announcement. Because he believes things. The old thing of politics should be politics and art should be art for art's sake, stupidest slogan ever. Because art for art's sake basically means the artist cannot have a brain. The artist is merely a technician. They're just meant to draw. Draw what? An artist is a storyteller. A storyteller is a storyteller. They have things to say. You can't say nothing. You got to say something. And since saying things is going to elicit disagreement from somebody, that's an act of politics. So that's like the dumbest slogan ever. Who coined that slogan? Art for art's sake. It's completely incoherent. You can't have art for art's sake. If you have art for art's sake, it's going to be generated by artificial intelligence. Because you're going to tell AI, make a drawing. But even AI, after a point, is going to ask you about what? What should I make a drawing about? And then when you say to AI, make a drawing about a happy family, the AI might come back to you and say, in which country? What class? Because AI is going to get intelligent. A happy family in what sense? Will there be two men in the family? Or do you want a man and a woman? That's political now. So incoherent, right? So I'm happy that these people exist. When you say all these people losing their jobs now, this is a social struggle. This is not one person fired, two people fired. This is large numbers of people. These are people that need to be political even more. You need to make a claim on the state. We need to be fighting against the very people who are gaslighting us. My friend Ghassan Haj, also from Beirut, teaches in Australia, was at the Max Planck Institute. He had a very good fellowship at the Max. He's a very famous sociologist, writes about race in Australia and all kinds of things. Anthropologist, not sociologist. Very famous anthropologist. They fired him from the Max Planck Institute, a month ago. Why? Because he had written some Facebook posts. For God's sake, man, those are Facebook posts, and his academic friends are reading them. And he wrote something pretty strong, but man, it's nothing. It was completely along the grain of anybody. Okay, so they fired him, and there's some hue and cry. But the Max Planck Institute's director released a video on their website. I really recommend you go. It's a completely gaslighting video. Because in this video, he talks about how he went. He said, it's so great to go to a demonstration. Okay, it's really exciting. And those of you who haven't been to a demonstration, I recommend it. And then he says, I went to a demonstration to defend democracy in Germany. Democracy in Germany. We must defend democracy. Because you can't have scholarly research without democracy. And I'm thinking, man, you just fired somebody. You just fired somebody while you made the video. That's the definition of gaslighting. You're out there turning the lights off and on. This guy has been fired. He can't understand what the hell is democracy anymore. He's a serious anthropologist, right? So what does one do? One has to politicize this. You can't have 1 million people fired or 5,000 people fired, even 100 people fired, and make this a question of personal employment. This is a political opportunity for them. They need to make a claim at the state. They need to fight for something transformative there, or in fact, fight to change the world where they will not be persecuted in this way. And personally, I wish I could hire all of them. But then I'd have to really talk to Javier Bardem.
Okay, so first of all, I wanted to thank you because it was through you that I discovered I just have math works. So again, thank you because your work was absolutely amazing. But back to the topic, I was thinking about what you were talking about earlier about the creation of a new social and cultural political consciousness. I cannot talk about, but which was carried out by the social liberation movements. And these, as I have seen, for example, in the case of the Tricontinental, with the Chinese magazine, Marxist magazine, which you have been translating, which is an amazing contribution, I think, because the Western and even anti-capitalist debates in relation to China are like the purest form through which this idea of the international division of humanity expresses itself. So I was wondering if you have thought within the Institute about extending these into other organizations which are present, but whose theorizations, debates, and discussions do not reach outside, and so, in some sense, producing what Enrico Dussel used to call when he called for a social dialogue.
You know, last year, the New York Times wrote a really amazing article, basically accusing me of being an agent of the Chinese government. It was an incredible moment, you know. And then that idiot, Marco Rubio, said that these people should be investigated by the US Department of Justice. I thought, man, you are an idiot, you know, seriously. And the New York Times, shameful. I mean, it's a shameful newspaper. The lies they told about October 7th, they hired an Israeli intelligence official to write a journalist. I mean, how is this even a newspaper, you know? And anyway, I mean, it was extraordinary. I mean, they said, you're an agent of the Chinese government. Well, firstly, I've never received any funds from China, from the government or from anybody. Private citizens, nobody. I wouldn't mind it. It's, you know, if some rich Chinese person said, hey, listen, we want to fund something, I wouldn't mind it. Honestly, what's wrong with that? Chinese are not aliens, but just by the way, Chinese are also real people. You know, they have feelings, and there's 1.4 billion of them, and they're not all the same. They think different things, and they have different dreams, and they're not all Ai Weiwei. That's the other thing. You know, Ai Weiwei's father was a very famous communist. If you may not know this, he was one of the leaders of the Chinese Revolution. So that magazine was interesting because, in fact, it's not a Marxist magazine. It's a liberal magazine. And we met the editor, Yan Ping, and what interested me was that in all this Sinophobia, okay, this hatred of China that's developing, the people who actually, you know how, look, during the Syrian conflict, there was a big thing, you know, if I was living in Beirut, covering the war, I was in the Kalamun Mountains, whatever, and when I would say things in public, people used to say, we don't want to hear from you, we want to hear from a Syrian. Yeah, you're irrelevant. We want Syrian voices, but not Assad, but other Syrian voices, you know. But this discourse is not there for the Chinese. People are perfectly happy to have a white European tell you about China, or the foreign minister of Germany interpret China for you. Nobody really walking around saying, we want to hear from the Chinese. You know, maybe some Chinese dissidents who are there, you know, but not from the Chinese. We don't want to hear from them. Especially not Chinese intellectuals, which I found curious. There's huge academy there. And there's enormous number of debates that they're having. And how can you, on this small little place called Europe, which is tiny population, yeah? It's what, 2/3 of the total population of India live in Europe. It's tiny. Sudan, undivided Sudan is bigger than France. Yeah, I mean, most of the African countries territorially are bigger than all. The Congo is 80 times the size of Belgium. And King Leopold said, I own it. It's 80 times the size of little Belgium. Yeah? Huge world out there, lots of people. You can't just be talking to yourselves. Yeah? So we said, okay, let's try to introduce some Chinese voices into discussions and debates about China. So editor Yan Ping, who runs this pretty mainstream, very popular magazine in China, Wenhua Zhongheng, we said we want to do an international edition. So we want to curate it, not publish every issue, but we want to take out some things we think are interesting. And so we've been curating this international, we've done, I think, the first 4 issues are out in English, Spanish, French, Portuguese, etc. And it's been an interesting issue because we're now reading young Chinese scholars. This young professor, I think she's from Shanghai International University, wrote a terrific article about China and Africa. It's her view of what's going on, industrialization, policies, and so on. Very interesting, captivating indeed. A different way of looking at China's role on the African continent. And that issue on China and Africa circulated widely on the African continent amongst intellectuals, policy makers, governments, and so on, because they may be dealing with a Chinese bureaucrat or with a Chinese company, but they're not thinking about how are the Chinese looking at us? How are they thinking and so on? Fascinating stuff, okay? So yes, and Dussel is on one side, sadly died last year, the great Argentinian scholar, died in Mexico. But also, by the way, there was an Ayatollah from Iran, somebody in the 1990s who made a call for a dialogue across civilizations. Yeah, very interesting phrase, dialogue across civilizations. Because they said that Iran is in a sense being isolated from the world. And we would like to have a dialogue across civilizations. There are different civilizations. I'm not that keen on the word civilization, but I understand what's going on here, A dialogue amongst peoples. Can we attend to how people are seeing things? Putin is a dictator and leave it at that. And sort of say all Russian people, including Tchaikovsky and Dostoevsky and so on, must be cancelled. Yeah? We don't want to listen to their point of view. Yeah? We're just going to cancel all of them. When they canceled Tchaikovsky, I thought that's incredible. That's incredible. What's going on with the culture? That people are so furious. It's a little bit like during the war in Iraq, when in the United States Congress, in the cafeteria, they stopped calling them French fries because France didn't support the US. They called them freedom fries. They canceled France. What's going on in our culture? We can't deal with people we don't like or that are doing things differently. Conviviality. I might not agree with you, but I have to learn to live with you. I can't just be doing regime change all over the world. Let people do their own politics. Let them have their own histories. Maybe there are ways in which we intervene and come in and say, give advice and whatever. But you can't bomb people into civilization. Yeah? Ask the Iraqis that. How did that go? That was terrible, appalling. Ask the Americans. You got your ass kicked in Afghanistan. You got your ass kicked in Iran. You've created chaos in Libya. How's this going for you? And now the same people are saying we're going to war with China. Really? You really think China, nuclear armed country, 1.4 billion people, you couldn't defeat the Taliban, friends. You got defeated by the Taliban and now you're going to... Are you serious? Are you a serious person, right? That's the dialogue. That's the conversation. I would love to meet these US... I would actually welcome Marco Rubio's Justice Department investigation. I would love to go in front of the senators and ask them directly, are you serious? Are you serious people? There was a US congressman recently caught on tape saying, I'm going to kill all Palestinians. Who are you that you feel obliged and empowered to say things like that? So yes, the dialogue, so important. It's so very, very important. I can't stress it more. And the interesting thing is places like the New York Times and so on, they think that having the dialogue is propaganda. So if we are saying these are Chinese voices, they're saying that's propaganda. So silence is reality. And the conversation is propaganda. Who's crazy now? Who's the fool now? Yeah. But Ejaz was amazing. I mean, he was amazing. I'm so glad that we were able to wrench out of him the book about his intellectual journey. Nothing Human is Alien to Me. I hope you get a chance to read that. Yeah, I really hope you do, because I spent about a week with him, and we talked about his childhood till, right toward the end of his life. We talked about the range, his intellectual journey. And for somebody like that, who was born in British India, moved to Pakistan to do his college career, there was a military coup, fled to the United States, translated a brilliant little book of the ghazals of Ghalib, which he did with leading US poets like Adrian Rich, W.S. Merwin, and people like that. He roughly translated the poem, the ghazal from Ghalib, into English and gave it to them. And then he would sit in front of them and recite it in Urdu non-stop, like a machine gun firing poetry. And they would listen to the Urdu, and they would read his rough translation, and then they wrote their version of the poem. It's firstly a genius methodology for translation. It's not like a wooden translation. It's a genuine crafted poet translating a remarkable poet from British India. And it was them putting their stamp, their own voice and music into the poem, listening to the Urdu, the sound of the Urdu. It's brilliant. But then, of course, he had a big debate with Frederick Jameson and Edward Said and so on. And later in his life, we spent hours and hours during the pandemic talking about Marx. And we made a little book called The Political Marx. Very nice, captivating person, genius in a way. But what a history, yeah? What a history.
So, unless I see other movements, maybe I will ask you one last thing before we close tonight. First of all, thank you again for putting on this floor. It has been on this floor every day since we started this program, because it's very important to speak about this genocidal violence that is happening and that we are all witnessing in real time. And I think it's important to take a microphone and not mention it. It's impossible to not speak of that. But there was a point that you raised that I would like to go back to, which I think is really important, which I think is so relevant today. And actually, for me, this questioning of the autonomy of art, or this abstraction of art, I actually remember reading Said at some point, Edward Said, in my very young years, and he said something like, I have yet to meet an artist who was able to abstract himself from his own life experience, exactly, or from the world around him, like this doesn't exist, this is the most absurd idea. And interestingly enough, when this is being insisted on today, it seems that it's just a total proof of the opposite. This violent silencing and criminalization of artists, poets, musicians, and scholars and writers seems to be linked to this very notion. And you at some point made another promise in your talk that you would go back to this very, very long section of the Bandung the Bandung Proclamation on culture. And for me, there is a kind of circle around this that is actually very contemporary. And I think for me and Sabel working on this project also, that was transformed by the context after October, it was quite interesting to constantly bump into things that were so relevant today. So I leave you with that last, question for you.
This is the problem of promising things. Some promises should not be redeemed, right? Otherwise, I mean, what kind of human are you? But yes, it actually reflects a little bit on that part of Agostino Neto saying, you know, we are in the middle of armed struggle and yet we must go to the conference in Algiers to talk about culture and so on. There's a great, I'm circling around Lebanon in a funny way, but there is a great Lebanese Marxist, Mehdi Amel, who, you know, when I lived in Beirut, I visited his wife, Evelyn, in their house. And it's just a super moving story because in 1987, he left their apartment to go pick up his pants from the laundry. And when he was shot dead, that laundry stub was still in his pocket. And she didn't change his office. The only change she made was on his desk, she had a large framed photo of him smiling. And the other change was he was very good at raising plants. So in photographs of his office, there was green ferns all over. And when I visited a few times, there was no green plants. And she said, I kill plants. He kept them alive. I kill them. But in his reflections on culture and politics and so on, anyway, out of that, I basically convinced them to allow me to create an English language version of some of his writings. Very hard to translate, but we made a collection which is available from Leftward Books, where I work as well in New Delhi, of some of his writings. Anyway, what interested me in his writings is the idea of backwardness. You know, I know that after postmodernism and all of that stuff, it's very difficult to talk about, say, we are a backward people. People say, well, that's offensive. You know, how can you say you're backward? There was a book written by Johannes Fabian. I've forgotten the name of the book, but he argued that all people live in the same time. Like, we all live in the same time, so there's no primitives, and so on. Okay, I agree with that. If you're writing about colonial anthropology, that's true. We all live in the same time. Nobody's primitive and other people are modern. We all are coeval, is the word he used. We live in a coeval time. We live together. However, colonialism does produce its backwardness for people. In 1950, and then he did a second edition of it, Octavio Paz wrote what I think is one of the most engaging books called Labyrinth of Solitude, which I think is just a genius book. And unfortunately, people on the left, because they don't like Paz, the book is not read as much. But I think Octavio Paz was a super insightful man. And in Labyrinth of Solitude, how many of you have read any Octavio Paz? Poetry or, yeah? It's a really interesting character. His book on India, Light of India, is extraordinarily interesting because he was the ambassador, Mexican ambassador in India. Anyway, Octavio Paz in Labyrinth of Solitude writes about how our sense of culture is so deformed in the backward world. Our sense of culture is so deformed that we don't have confidence in ourselves. We feel that the West has science and rationality, and in fact history, and we don't, and we are behind them. We are backward. And indeed, that sense of backwardness becomes real. It becomes a real thing. You know, we want to become Western. We want to become like the West and so on. We don't have confidence in our own traditions. We have a history that seems broken, deformed in a way, yeah? We are not people who are modern. We are traditional. Those binaries of the Cold War era, they kind of paralyzed Octavio Paz. And in the book, he kind of longs, in that long essay, he longs for a time when Mexico can break away from this bondage, this sense of we are caught in tradition. And they, across the Rio Grande, they are modern. You know, Estados Unidos, they are modern. You know, they have achieved modernity. We are also Estados Unidos, but of a different kind. You know, we are of Mexico, and it's backward and traditional, and even our revolution of 1911 couldn't break through. It's a great text for that. Mehdi Hamel writes about backwardness. We are backward. Our backwardness is also material. You know, we have illiteracy in our societies. We have to confront illiteracy. And so in the Cuban Revolution, the first thing was mass literacy campaign. We're going to make sure everybody learns to read and write. And incredibly, the literacy rate rises. In the Soviet Union as well, mass literacy, you know, campaigns. China, mass literacy campaign. When the British left India, the literacy rate in India was 12.7%. That's how good colonial civilization was. And India was like the jewel in the crown, 12.7%. That's abysmal, yeah? We are backward people. We have to overcome our backwardness. That's what Mehdi Hamel writes about. How do we overcome our backwardness? It's a pretty provocative question. But in fact, it's also a normal question in the world of the third world. Because at Bandung, in the communique is about transcending our backwardness. And it's about ending racism. It's actually interesting if you read that. 1955. There really isn't that much difference between the Bandung communique on culture and Présence Africaine in Paris, Alain Duop. It's not a huge difference. Negritude, you know, the movement, Aimé Césaire, and so on. It's not that different from that. Because it's saying that we have to have a confidence in ourselves. Now, I believe that some traditions go too far. You know, the great Marxist from Peru, Jose Carlos Mariátegui, he writes that we shouldn't treat the past like a destination. The past is a resource. You don't want to go back to the past. It's not a destination. We don't want to U-turn and go back. So we don't want to, for instance, say the great, you know, Inca tradition. We want to be Incas again. No, we want to go forward. But we want the past as a resource for us. It's incredible stuff in that tradition of the third world. And Mariátegui is writing this in 1928. Bandung Conference 1955. Présence Africaine 1950s, Negritude and so on. That's the tradition of national liberation looking at culture. We don't want to be backward people. We are not, it's both statements at the same time. We refuse your statement that we are backward, we are anti-racist, but we also don't want to be backward people. We want literacy, we want education, we want to restart our cultural traditions. We don't want to feel like your culture is culture and our culture is craft. We are artisans, you are artists. We want to transcend that binary. We are also artists, but not in a way that's patronizing. Oh, look, primitivism, so cute, the way you draw. You know, we don't want to be patronized into transforming the binary. We want to transform the binary, and that's a power of that national liberation discussion about culture. And in fact, just to wind this, that's what that whole show is about. It's about people, whether at an early period of their struggle or after they've been overthrown, the coups and so on, insisting on both things. We refuse your designation of our backwardness. And also we refuse to be backward. That double thinking about backwardness, that's what defines the whole artistic experience of national liberation.
Before I say goodbye to Vijay or ask you all to join me in doing that, voy a decirlo en castellano. Or maybe I say it in English so you can understand.
I can understand because our friends are so delightful and I want to listen to their voices as well.
Okay. Entonces, hablando de, o volviendo a Alemania, a otra de esas promesas que circularon, el sábado va a estar aquí Yazan Khalili, junto con Eric Beltrán, y de Lumbung Press y de On the Question of Funding, y y vamos a volver a ese tema. Ellos estuvieron en la última documenta y fueron parte de toda esa problemática de este intento de silenciar ciertas voces muy específicas dentro de la cultura. But this I will say in English because I want you to hear. Thank you so much, Vijay. We feel very honored to have had you here, and thank you for your generosity and for your work, which I know many who are here are following, and thank you for not being silent, or for that persistent non-silencing, and for that persistent vivacity of making sure we are not engaging in a culture of death, but always in a culture of life. So please join me in thanking Vijay Prashad.
No, thanks a lot. Thanks, great, thanks a lot.